I need somebody to read 2 Timothy 2:15 for me. Right now.
Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, and who correctly handles the word of truth.
All right, he says, a workman who correctly handles the word of truth. What does that mean?
One who kind of correctly teaches messages, like teaches the message of God, I would think.
Okay.
Correctly teaches it.
Correctly teaches, okay.
Well, it implies also that just because you have the word doesn't mean that you're going to be doing it correctly, that you're going to be spreading that word
True.
correctly.
True.
So be careful of that.
Yeah.
I think it means there's not very many good workmen.
Unfortunately. We also hear about rightly dividing the word of truth. What does that mean? To rightly divide the word of truth.
Interpret in context.
That's well said. When I began to understand that Bible study is not just a matter of opening the Bible and reading a verse or talking about it, but to properly study the Bible and to understand it, you have to put it in its context. And when you use the word context, what do you mean?
I mean, the subject matter and the point of who he's talking to.
Yeah.
And
Who wrote it? Who you talking to? What's going on at the time? Sometimes those things are absolutely crucial to understanding the text. For example, if you read the book of 1 John, and I did this for years and didn't realize that book was given to combat a particular heresy. And once I understood that, everything began to make sense. And a lot of the Bible is that way. You have to put it in its proper context. It's big picture. And so that's what I'm attempting to do with these lessons that we're looking at. We're looking now at the themes of the books. When you study a book of the Bible, you have to understand that book was written for a reason. It's got a purpose behind it. And if you study the book with that in mind, it makes the book much more meaningful. For example, the book of Matthew. What's the theme of Matthew? I mean, we've got 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why are there 4? Why isn't there just one big one?
Aspects of Jesus.
Something important for each one.
Okay, the Gospels give us 4 different pictures of Jesus. And you have to understand that to understand that book. Matthew, the theme of that book is Jesus is the King. He's the Messiah that was promised. That's why it starts off with the most boring 14 verses in the Bible. So-and-so beget, so-and-so beget, so-and-so. There's a reason for that being in there. And so every book of the Bible has a theme behind it. It's got a purpose. It fits into the big picture. It fits into the whole. If you're going to build a car and you've got a jillion pieces, what do you need to know?
They go together.
Yeah. How's this all going to fit together? What am I going to have when I get through building it?
In what order?
Yeah, in what order? You know, it's like if you're putting a puzzle together. If it's a real complicated puzzle, you need some kind of picture of what you're going to get when you get through putting it together.
Boxed up.
Yeah. So that's what we're looking at. And I've redone the notes. This is different from last week. I've added some slides to it. And I'm trying to give you a complete list of all the themes of the books in the Bible. Whenever you study a book, the first thing you need to determine is, what is this book about? What's it trying to accomplish? For example, the book of Ecclesiastes. Whoa.
Preston.
Yeah, if you just read the first few chapters of that book, you want to shoot yourself. I mean, it's really depressing. Everything it says is, well, this is meaningless or worthless or, yeah. But when you understand what he's getting at, what the picture of the whole book is, that makes good sense. And so when we study the Bible, we need to get a big picture. Now, in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the 12 historical periods of the Old Testament. This helped me study the Bible as much as anything I ever learned. This afternoon I went home. She hasn't seen this in 20 years, but she used to go to my classes where I taught this. And I said, okay, give me the 12 historical periods. And she almost got all of them perfectly. I was astounded that she could remember it after that long.
Antediluvian, post-diluvian.
Yeah, antediluvian, post-diluvian, all that. Yeah, that's crucial. When I taught Bible at OC, I was the teacher that taught the survey of the Old Testament and the survey of the New Testament classes. And the comment I got most often from my students was, for the first time, I've got a teacher that makes this stuff make sense. It all fits together. And to me, that was the greatest compliment they could have given me. That finally, the Bible starts to come together and make sense. It's not just a collection of thousands of teachings, but it's got a whole unified purpose behind it. In physics, who's the smartest guy ever lived? Einstein. When Einstein came along, he proposed a unified field theory. And that revolutionized science. I mean, it advanced science more than any other theory in history. Because for the first time, they began to see, hey, electromagnetic, gravitational, all these forces are one system. And then they began to study one in terms of the other, and man, huge strides were made. And we got such wonderful inventions as the atomic bomb out of that. I mean, but at any rate, to understand the Bible, you've got to get the big picture. And so that's what I'm trying to do. So tonight we're looking at the themes. Because I think the themes, did you mess with my computer?
I was,
I bet she did it.
I thought it'd be fun.
Yeah.
Steve at OC, our last class was biblical research, and he was saying, the way he put it was, you have to know, there's the behind the text,
Yes.
and then there's,
Yes.
which is like what you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. When you study a book like Hebrews, if you don't understand that principle, half of that book doesn't make any sense at all. And so it's crucial to understanding the Bible. All right, some of these we covered last week, so we'll hit them pretty fast, but I've added a slide or two in here. The theme of the Bible is Jesus. The Old Testament, Jesus is coming. The Gospels, Jesus is here. The New Testament, Jesus is coming back. We looked at that last time. Now here I've added this in here since last week. The Bible divisions. The Jews divide the Bible into various sections. The Pentateuch, what's the word penta mean? Five. Okay. So it's the 5 books of the law. And so this is the Genesis through Deuteronomy is known as the Pentateuch. Then the histories, Joshua through 2nd Chronicles. This section tells us more about the history of what was going on in Israel. The exile period, Ezra through Esther, cover the major activities during that period. The wisdom literature, Book of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Why do you need to know about these? Why is it important that we understand this is a separate section of Scripture? Well, I'm glad you asked. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the prophets. There are two categories, major and minor. Now, the Bible doesn't make that distinction. Those are human. What's the difference in a major prophet and a minor prophet?
Longer,
They're
shorter.
bigger. Yeah, the big ones are the major prophets. The small, shorter ones are the minor prophets. But other than that, there's no significant difference. All right, so these are the divisions of the Bible that the Jews understood, and they're still good today, for that matter. All right, and then dividing the rest of the New Testament, we have the Gospels, we have the establishment and spread of the kingdom, as found in the book of Acts. And we have how salvation works in Romans, and then the epistles, 1 Corinthians. What's an epistle? It's a letter. Okay, these are the letters, and this is the divisions of the New Testament. This helps us to understand what God's got in mind. All right, Genesis. We talked about this last week. Genesis is the theme, is the origins of everything. Where did humanity come from? Where did the creation come from? Where does sin come from? And so forth. It talks about Abraham and how righteousness is credited. It talks about the origin of the 12 tribes. Exodus, obviously, is when the children of Israel left Egypt. Where did I get to last week? You may remember?
Ruth,
Ruth? Yeah, we got to Ruth. I think that's right. Okay. So I won't talk much about these at all. Leviticus, making the people holy. Numbers is the wilderness discipline. And then Deuteronomy is the warnings to remain faithful to God. Joshua is the conquest of Canaan. Judges is that period of time when Israel rebelled against God. He would punish them, and then he would deliver them with a judge. Yeah, we got to Ruth last time. And then Ruth, the main concept in there is the kinsman redeemer. It's a perfect image. That book, that little book, when you read it in the Old Testament, you think, why is that even there? But it's a perfect image of Jesus Christ to us. He is our kinsman redeemer. Why is he kin to us? How is Jesus kin to us?
Because when we're baptized, we're adopted as sons and daughters.
Okay. Also, we're made in the image of God. And so we are that way like him. And then also that there's a Gentile in the line of Christ. Okay, I think that's where we finished up last week. All right, we now get to 1 Samuel. All right, so God put mankind in the garden and gave him dominion over the earth. We sinned. We lost the kingdom that God had given us. So God then began a plan to bring us back. And that's what the Bible is. It's a story of how God works it out so you and I can be reconciled back to him and we can have salvation. And we saw already that God picked a man. Who was the man? Abraham. Abraham was the man of faith. He's the one that was made righteous because of his faith. And then God needed a people. And we saw how God used Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to create a race of people, the Jews. They were selected for one purpose. And what was it? To bring the Messiah to the earth. They weren't selected because they were better and more moral and smarter. They were selected to do a job. And so 1 Samuel picks up the next thing God needs. He's got a people, and now he needs a kingdom. Because the kingdom is going to serve as the model to bring the Messiah to the earth. And so 1 Samuel is the beginning of the monarchy. It's where the origin of the monarchy in Israel. And it talks about the reign of King Saul. Again, what is the number one subject discussed in the Old and New Testaments? Kingdom. I was shocked when I first heard that and began to do some research. And it's incredible what percentage of the Bible talks about kingdom. Jesus even said, I came to bring the kingdom. the first thing, the message he preached was, repent, for the kingdom is here. It's at hand. The first thing John preached was, repent, for the kingdom is near. It's here. And so everything is about the kingdom. And so 1 Samuel tells us how the kingdom began in the Old Covenant. 2 Samuel talks about the reign of King David. How's King David germane to this argument, to this story?
Because he assumed that the Messiah will come from it. It's gonna
Yes,
be-
the Messiah will come out of his line. And so God made a covenant with David and says, out of your descendants will come the king that I am sending to reestablish the kingdom that you lost. Why are all those lineages in the Bible? To prove that Jesus had the right to be the king. It's astounding to me. I mean, he's the Son of God. What's he got to prove? But to the Jews, it had to be totally legal. And so Jesus could prove from both his mother's side and his father's side that he came from the line of David. So no matter what else they might claim, they can't say, well, he doesn't have the credentials to be the king. And so he made the covenant with David, the Davidic covenant. The Messiah will come from the house of David. And so that's what the book of 2 Samuel is describing. Yes?
That made me think about whenever you said that, proof of lineage.
Uh-huh.
It seems like back in the back of my brain, there's a memory that said that most of the Jews carried a flag of their tribe.
Yeah.
And they hung it out over their house, so everybody knew what family their lineage was.
Yeah.
You know, and here was Jesus, Judah.
That's very
But
possible.
they had a problem with that.
That's very possible, yeah. And when the emperor of Rome demanded that all the Jews go to their hometowns to register to vote, Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem. Why? Because Bethlehem was the headquarters, the first headquarters of the tribe of Judah. When the division of the country was made, Judah got a section of the country, and Bethlehem was the headquarters. And so that became the official spot for the tribe of Judah. Every person who descended from the house of Judah had to go to Bethlehem to register for taxes. So naturally, Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem. It's amazing how all these pieces come together to fulfill God's master plan. And then 2 Samuel also talks about the reign of Solomon and the kingdom's division because of Solomon's sin. Sorry, 1 Kings. And then in 2 Kings, we find where the kingdom began to slide away. The people of Israel turned away from God and worshiped the gods of Canaan. The Baals and the Asherahs and the Molechs and those gods. And so 2 Kings traces the departure of Israel from God and began to set the stage for the world empires to come on the scene. And then at the end of 2 Kings, we have the destruction of Samaria by the Assyrians in 722. This is where the Samaritans came from. Why was Samaria destroyed?
Conquered by the Persians, right?
No, they were conquered by the Assyrians. But why did God destroy them?
Worshiping other gods.
There's worshiping false gods. He sent prophet after prophet after prophet to warn them, turn back to me or I'm going to bring disaster. And naturally, they didn't listen.
Again, the Samaritans came from, they took those people
Yeah.
and they mixed them with,
Yeah. When the Assyrians conquered countries, they had a unique way of dealing with conquered peoples. Ordinarily, when a nation would conquer other people, they would despoil the land, they would steal all the valuables, and they would carry off a percentage of the population as slaves. When the Assyrians conquered a region, not only would they carry off part of the population as slaves, they would then bring in populations from the rest of their empire and mix them all up. What effect would that have?
It made, yeah, so you'd cease to be, you couldn't have any national.
Yeah, yeah.
You'd be mixed.
Yeah, you would destroy the nationality of the country, and that would keep them from rebelling eventually against Assyria. It's kind of a brilliant plan, really. Now, the other nations didn't do this. It was the Samaritans, the Assyrians were known as the meanest, cruelest, most vicious people that ever lived on the planet. They have found artwork and documents that describe the Assyrian attitude toward warfare. And they believed devoutly in terrorizing the population. They would often go in and they would see how many heads they could cut off and pile up. See how big a pile of heads they could make. They would lay men, women, and children out on the ground, and they would run over them with sleds. They were known for their fish hooks. They had these huge fish hooks, and they would hook people on fish hooks and drag. That's one of the reasons that who's the prophet that got ate by the fish? Jonah. That's why Jonah did not want to go to Samaria, to Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital. He didn't want them to repent. He said, these people are so vicious and cruel, they ought to be wiped out. And so that's why that book, because it was the Samaritans, or the Assyrians, incredible cruelty. No other nation in history has been as cruel as the Assyrians were. In 2 Kings, toward the end of the book, it talks about the destruction of Samaria. And then it also describes the first invasion of Judah by Babylon. After the destruction of Samaria, the Babylonians knocked off the Assyrians. They took over. They had a huge battle in 612 BC. And the Babylonians knocked off the Assyrians. So they became the world power. And they came down into Judah and put Judah under their control, but they did not destroy the country. They forced the people of Judah to pay tribute to them, and they carried off some of the people, particularly some of the young people, to train to be working for them. And this is where Daniel and his friends were carried off by the Babylonians in 605. And they were to be trained as court officials for Babylon, and then to be used to rule over the countries that they would conquer. But what did God do with that? This is what's amazing to me.
He used them to kind of humble the...
Yeah, he used those guys that they carried off for his purposes, to accomplish his goals. It's fascinating how God will do that. Daniel became a real important character in the government of Babylon, and later on, the government of Persia. So Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon for training. And then, in 586, the Jews in Jerusalem rebelled against Babylon and said, we're not paying you any more money. We're going to join with Egypt, and we're going to fight. And the king of Babylon said, Egypt's not going to help you. I'm coming to get you. And so he invaded, and he knocked off the Egyptians, and then he surrounded Jerusalem and leveled the city.
It's amazing how stubborn they were.
Oh.
Look at Jeremiah.
Oh.
They're talking to them. We're not going
Yes.
to. No, we're going to continue to
Yeah.
offer our offerings.
Yeah.
We were better off back then.
Yeah. Prophet after prophet was sent by God. Don't do this. Don't make agreements with Egypt. Trust me, I'll take care of it. But they wouldn't listen. And so finally, the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar was a great king. But what's one thing he would not put up with?
Insurrection.
You don't put up with rebellion of the subject peoples. And so he made an example out of the Jews. He leveled the city. He destroyed the temple. He carried off all the valuables. He deported the entire population of Jerusalem to Babylon to be slaves. And so the Jews were taken captive to Babylon. Almost the entire race was carried off.
And that's where the records were destroyed?
And, well, that's when some of the priest records, but not the final destruction. That was
70.
Yeah, that was 70 AD, yeah. But some of the priests lost their records here, and so when they came back, they couldn't be priests.
I was reading in my history book that they're saying that may have been the impetus for the remaining Jews that knew how to write, the scribes and all of those that were taken into captivity. The captivity was the thing that said, okay, we've got to write all of this down. We've got to write all this history
Yes.
of the Jews down so that we've got it.
Yeah, there were several histories written during that period, yeah. Yeah, to keep their record, because they were there for 70 years. And then the book of First Chronicles. Now this is a puzzling. Up until now, there's been very little repetition. But First and Second Chronicles are largely repeating what happened in Samuel and Kings, with some additions in there, but a lot of it is repeated. And so in First Chronicles, it goes back and gives us the reign of King David, even after we just saw it in Samuel. Why in the world? Well, it's because David was such an important figure in God's master plan to bring the Messiah to the earth. And so once again, Chronicles talks about the reign of King David. Second Chronicles gives us the history of Judah. It almost completely ignores the northern kingdom and talks about Judah, because that's what's going to become the focus of God's master plan.
What's the date of the Chronicles versus Samuel?
Well, when they were written, the experts think it was several hundred years later. The experts believe that Chronicles was written after the Jews came back from Babylonian captivity, but that's a guess. We don't know that. The same events occur in Samuel and in Chronicles.
Who was the author of the Chronicles?
Well, again, we don't know. Some people think it was Ezra. We're not sure. The Bible does not tell us. All right, so Second Chronicles gives us the return from Babylonian. I'm sorry, Ezra. The book of Ezra tells us about the return from Babylonian captivity in 535. Now remember, what was the date of the first invasion by Babylon?
600?
605. What had the prophecy said about the length of captivity?
70?
70 years. How do you get the 70 years? If you go back to 605, and then in 535, they went home. And so that's the 70 years. Yes.
I have a question about home.
Okay.
It's mentioned a lot about Jerusalem being taken in captive, but really it was Judah, the whole.
Yeah, it was Judah. Yeah.
Is that about the same size as Israel is today? Judah? Back then? It encompassed all along the
Yeah,
Jordan and all
roughly.
that. That was a pretty big area.
It's a good big area. I'd have to check a map on that. I'm not sure exactly how much they count today. I've always focused on.
I don't know.
I've always focused on biblical times. I don't focus much on modern times.
Because they don't mention any towns that you can pinpoint.
Yeah, it's not easy.
No.
At any rate, in 535, now they'd been captive for 70 years. Now most of them had gone in 586, so they had been captive for about 50 years. Yeah, about 50 years. God decided, okay, now it's time for the Israelites to go home and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple. So in 535, he gave King Cyrus. Now, during this time, the Persians had knocked off the Babylonians. They had invaded. They had snuck under the wall and conquered the city. And King Cyrus now rules the world from Persia. He's a Persian. And God told Cyrus, now, and the Persians had taken the Jews into their empire. And so the Jews were now under Persian power. And so God told King Cyrus to let the Jews return to captivity. Now what's fascinating is he issued a decree that the Jews could return home. We have a copy of that decree in a museum. I think it's the Louvre. It's called the Cyrus Cylinder. It's this clay, round, weird-looking shape, and it's got recorded on the Cyrus Cylinder the instructions by King Cyrus to allow the Jews to return home, proving conclusively this part of the Bible is absolute truth. And so King Cyrus decreed that the Jews could return home. Zerubbabel led the first group of Jews from Persia back to Babylon, back to Israel. And God told them the first thing to do is what? Get worship going. He says, don't worry about your businesses, don't worry about your houses. Get the temple, get the altar, get sacrifices started. Your relationship to me takes precedence over everything else. And when they first got back, they started on the temple. But guess what? After a few months, they said, we got to get the crops in. We got to build houses. We got to get our businesses going. So they quit working on the temple. And so God sent a prophet to them, telling them, get your priorities straight. And so they finally rebuilt the temple and got worship going again in Israel. Unfortunately, the second temple wasn't nearly as gaudy as the first. But that's the book of Ezra. It's returning from captivity and rebuilding the temple. Nehemiah, the theme of this one is rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. The walls had been torn down. Why do you need walls? Well, in those days, walls were, you couldn't have a city without walls because they had to keep the invaders out. There were all kinds of marauders and raiders. And so the first thing you have to do is build the walls. Well, Nehemiah is working for the king of Persia, Artaxerxes. And he finds out from his brother that the walls have not been rebuilt, even though the people have been back for many years. And so the king allows Nehemiah to return to Jerusalem with authority to requisition materials to rebuild the walls. And so when Nehemiah got back to Jerusalem, he organized all the people and he gave each one of them a section of the wall to build, and they got the walls built in a few months. It was really well done. Esther is one of those unusual, amazing books.
God is not mentioned in this book.
God is not even mentioned in the book. That's amazing. This is back in Persia, where this particular event occurs. You remember the story. The king of Persia, wife insults him, he thinks. So he fires her from her job. And he says, I need a new queen. And so they brought in the most beautiful women from all over Persia. And one of the women they brought in was Esther. She was a Jewess. And the king saw her, and he picked her for his king. But there was an evil man in the kingdom, Haman. And Haman had been insulted by Esther's uncle, Mordecai. And he wanted vengeance. You talk about... He wants to kill the entire race of Jews to get revenge on one guy. I mean, you talk about... Woo, that's vengeance, man. And so that's the story that God delivers. Now, what would be the theme of this book? What would logically be a theme for this book? Well, I guess you got there on
You
your
got it right here.
Yeah.
I'm gonna guess.
What is providence? What is God's providence?
He provides.
Yeah.
Let's see.
It's how God works things out. God works things out. The whole Bible is just full of His providence. And so God arranged for the Israelites to be saved from the Persians.
I notice this is, they arranged this at the end of the exile period, right?
Yes.
Is that because, if I understand, or if I understood, nobody knows exactly when this was written?
Right.
Who wrote it?
Right. This is one of those that we're real fuzzy on who wrote it and why. When. It tells the story, though, of the saving of the Jewish people.
I need that today. All the anti-Semitism.
If you ever observe Hanukkah at Christmas time, Jews do, that's where this came from. Hanukkah is the celebration of God's deliverance of the Jews from the Persians.
Purim.
Purim, yeah. Job, this is another one of those books. You read it and you say, what in the world has this book got to do with anything? Now, I told you that this is part of a select section of the Old Testament that's called the wisdom literature. How is wisdom literature different from histories or prophets?
Deals more with God's dealing with His people, mainly. Through knowledge and, learning praises and prayer and psalms and all that.
Okay. What is different about the way Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon are written than all the other books? What style of literature is it? Poetry. What is poetry? How is poetry different from other kinds of literature?
David considered it Psalms. Psalms. Yeah.
Yeah, I've never been a big poetry kind of guy myself. Yeah? How is poetry different from what's normal writing? Prose? What do you call just an ordinary writing? Prose, is that right?
Ordinary writing.
Yeah, ordinary writing. You got history. You've got history, which is basically a recounting of facts. You've got prose, which sometimes tells the story. But then you've got poetry.
So now you're talking about iambic pentameter.
Yeah, and all that kind of stuff. How is poetry to be read differently than other forms of literature?
It's not literal.
It's not literal. It's not meant to be taken literally all
How
the
about
time.
factually?
It's not meant to be factual.
So is it euphemisms and
It's
similes?
euphemisms, it's poetical. When I was dating Sharon, I would wax poetic. Roses are red, violets are blue.
You said that too many times, she took off her shoes.
Yeah, she did.
No.
And she married me anyway. So, when you read Job and Psalms and Proverbs, you're not reading it to get facts. You're reading it to get, what's poetry more about than facts? Feelings.
Ideas, themes.
It's feelings. It's emotion.
Intrinsic thinking.
Yeah, whatever that means.
It's hyperbole.
It's hyperbole. It's not meant to be taken as literally as other types of literature. So when you read these books, you have to read them as poetry. Now, why don't they read like poetry?
Because it's different.
Well, because it's not our poetry.
It's not our poetry, it's Hebrew poetry, which is different than American. It's like British humor. It's different than American humor. Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait next week to see where, or 2 weeks to see where this goes. Boy, that time went fast.